Caribbean writers and their art, a series of conversations with some writers from the English-speaking Caribbean, in which we hope that we'll give you some sense of the exciting work that's has come out of the region, and some of the new developments that are taking place in English-speaking Caribbean literature. My name is Edward Baugh, and I'm from the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica, and I'm a professor of English there. And we thought that for the opening program in this series, we could do no better than start with, as our first guest, Edward Kamau Brathwaite, who is one of the most distinguished, one of the most considerable poets of the Caribbean. He also wears a couple of other hats. He is also Professor of Social and Cultural History in the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and also Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, which we have there at Mona in Jamaica. And I think he'll be telling us about some of these things. And I thought that we might ask Kamau Brathwaite to put our series of conversations in perspective by telling us something about Caribbean literature in the context of Caribbean history, especially since he is both historian and poet.
But before that, perhaps we ought to explain why we are here.
Yes.
I'm the director, the co-director of this remarkable occasion, which is a Caribbean Writers' Workshop being hosted by the University of Miami at Coral Gables. And why we are so excited about it is that it is the first time, in fact, after all these years, that we are having such an occasion. This is the first time that Caribbean writers have had the opportunity to meet together for 5 weeks, as it is in this case, at all levels of achievement. There's George Lamming, who is the director of the prose. I'm director of the poetry. And we have people coming in like Michael Anthony, who you will see later in the program, who is a considerable writer in his own right. And then people who are now at the beginning, the threshold of their careers. And what is so exciting about this is the weave of influences which we detect and the sense of continuity. It is almost like the islands themselves, threading from Florida right through to the Guyanese and the Belizean coasts.
But isn't it curious that this is happening in Miami at Coral Gables? Now, there must be... Could you say something about how this has come about and what you see as any significance, any particular significance of the fact that this coming together of Caribbean writers in a workshop is happening in Miami?
We are beginning to think more and more that Miami is perhaps becoming another Caribbean island. I mean, that is really what is going on. Miami, for a long time now, has become the center for Caribbean activity. We have a lot of Cuban presence here, a Haitian presence, and a very large Jamaican community. And with the resources available to the United States and with the kind of vision which obviously is coming out of places like the University of Miami, we have been able to gather here rather than in the Caribbean, where our resources are more limited and where therefore the opportunities for this kind of thing on a scale and a duration that this implies is not possible.
Yes, and would you see this as fostering some sort of long overdue, genuine pan-Caribbean vision? In other words, having something very valuable to contribute to developments in relationships between the great US of A.
Yes, and the mainland, as you can put it. Yes, because what I think is going to happen later, because my understanding is that this is only the first, a kind of pilot, and that there will be at least 3 such workshops, is that with the presence in Miami of Cuban and Haitian populations and North American, Afro-American and other ethnic groups from North America, that as we develop this kind of exercise, that we will have these influences coming in.
Yes, and I believe that James Michener, who in a way was behind this, his book on the Caribbean, in a sense started it all off, had a sort of vision, I gather, Miami indeed as a part of the Caribbean,
yes,
even more
indeed,
than
right.
part of the USA.
So here we are sailing into the Caribbean in Miami.
Yes, fine. So now that you've explained so well why you and all the other writers are here.
And happy to be here.
And happy to be here. Perhaps you could take up what I threw out at you at the beginning to set a sort of perspective, identify the region of writing we're talking about and put it in the context of the history.
Yes, starting with Florida, where we are. That peninsula jutting out into the Caribbean Sea is the beginning of a whole chain of islands, which some people know as tourists, some people know because they have worked there from time to time. But I don't think many people in this country are aware of the vast and enormous extent of these islands. I mean, it's a 3,000-mile arc stretching from the tip of Florida into the Bahamas. Then you have Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo. You have Jamaica, you have the Virgin Islands, you have what we call the Leeward Islands and the Windward Islands. You have Barbados, where I come from, a very small coral island, a bit eccentric to that curve, but still very much there. Trinidad, getting close to the mainland. And then we call Guyana and Belize parts of the Caribbean. These are two mainland territories which complete this 3,000-mile arc of some 3,000 islands, if not more.
And I think the concept of Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean literature, or West Indian literature, as we say, even extends out into the Atlantic to the Bahamas.
And Bermuda.
And Bermuda.
Although some Bermudians feel that they're not
So in a
part of
sense,
that.
as you say, it's a wide-spanning term when we're talking about the literature. Now, one other point on this, that although we're focusing on English Caribbean literature, a very important consideration is the relationship of that, and I think you have some strong ideas on this, of that to the literatures in the other languages, the Spanish Caribbean and the French Caribbean and even the Dutch Caribbean. And since Miami is a place where, for instance, the Spanish Caribbean, and indeed Haitians, as you say, are in such numbers, would you say something about how you see the development, or whether you see that that should be a development in comparative?
There will be that. In fact, I would suspect that comparative literary developments are probably going to take place within English departments in the United States quite soon. In fact, they are taking place in some other universities right now. It is necessary that we do this because the Caribbean, although artificially divided into English-speaking, French-speaking, Dutch-speaking, Spanish-speaking, is really part of a whole underground continent of thought and feeling and history. That arc I described is really part of a cordillera that once stretched from the Gulf of Honduras, from Yucatan, right out into what I call Atlantis. And about 1 million years ago, there was this perturbation of the atmosphere, this cataclysm, which destroyed the Cordillera at right angles to the Andes and the Rockies, and left us with only the tips of mountain tops.
Which are the islands.
Which our islands are. But which means that under the water, submarine, there is a whole unity of Caribbean, which we must always remember.
Fine.
And therefore, we have to cut across as much as we can this language barrier, which of course the United States is already providing, in order to get a pure picture of what Caribbean really means.
Yes, and this language division, which you rightly say is artificial, is of course a result, one factor in the whole colonial history of the region. Could you say something about other ways in which the literature and the emergence of English Caribbean literature has been determined by colonial history?
Yes. Well, the first thing is, why not let us look at the colonial development first? Because before Columbus, who will be back with us next year, these islands were part of a single culture, let us say the Tanaian or Amerindian culture. And it is with the intrusion of Columbus, the arrival of Europeans, that the islands had their second fragmentation, the first one being the destruction of the mountain range into these little juts and tips. What happened was that Columbus arrived with the Spanish concept of nation, and they appropriated certain areas for their own, and they said, thou shalt speak Spanish from now on and no longer Carib or Arawak. Then the English and the French arrived, and they took what was left from the Spanish Empire, and they said, here we have English and French. And then the Dutch got a little piece and so on. As a result, the mercantilists or the economic policies of these various nations also began to have an effect, so that people in the Caribbean no longer were in touch with each other. There was no longer any communication between, let us say, Martinique and St. Lucia. In the days of the Caribs, you could take a canoe and travel easily from St. Lucia to Martinique. Now, with the arrival of Europe, despite Europe's technology, it is almost impossible to move from St. Lucia to Martinique. And let me explain that they are within hailing distance of each other.
Indeed, one can see the other
from the highlands, day, yeah. Right, yeah. What happens now is that if I wish to go from St. Lucia to Martinique, either I swim in danger of sharks, or I have to get an English ocean liner which will take me from St. Lucia all the way back to London. From London, get the Channel ferry to Bordeaux or to Calais, get a French liner that will take me then from Calais or Bordeaux all the way back to Martinique.
Except there's a shorter, more, but still indirect route. You could fly to Barbados.
Yes.
And then take another flight.
Yes, you can do that. Yeah. But technically, that is now the route, and the telephone lines are very much the same, which means that we have become artificially separated from each other. And therefore, our sense of region is also fragmented.
Right. Now, can you say something about how the fact, just looking within the Anglophone Caribbean, of that colonial cultural heritage, which is part of the general heritage, impinged on what literature has come out of?
Yes, right. Well, the English, all of these nation states, the European nation states, were very strong in their imprint, and they insisted, in fact, that their colonies should be imitations of themselves, chips off their old blocks, except that we also went through what I call a kind of alter renaissance, in that we did not get the very best of the mother cultures. There was a kind of Mammonization, a kind of effort to insist on only an economic rather than a spiritual aspect of life development. In other words, Shakespeare didn't come here. We had instead Cortes, we had Drake, we had Raleigh, we had the people who were concerned with gleaning gold, with profit. And as a result, our educational system became skewered in a way so that we did not, in fact, have an education that gave us a sense of ourselves. We did not learn our own trees, we did not learn our own vegetation, we did not know the names of our own landscapes. We were taught half-heartedly the culture of the mother country, so that when we came into literature, we were in fact singing falsely their songs and repeating falsely their rhythms. For instance, you know, the boy stood on the burning deck when Saul but he had fled. Pretty standard stuff.
Iambic.
Well, and not only that, but, you know, the boy, I mean, the charge of the light brigade, I wandered lonely. These are the things that we were presented to us and which we absorbed as the norm. So that instead of developing a sense of ourselves, we developed a false sense of Europe.
Good.
And the concern of Caribbean literature since about, let us say, the turn of the century, since the beginning of the 20th century, certainly since the move towards independence came in about 1930, 1938, has been to try to de-educate ourselves out of that English-European mold and find for ourselves our own language and our own forms.
Yeah, well, I think that gives us a very good idea of the general picture. Raleigh was also a poet, but a minor poet, and so it's a footnote to your point. No,
I
think we can put all of this nicely into specific specific terms by focusing now on your own work.
Yes.
And maybe you could tell us something about how your own development as a poet.
Yeah, let me show you how I broke through
Right.
out of that mold.
Excellent.
Let me explain. I have to start with where I was born, in this island of Barbados, Little England, we proudly called it. It is a coral island off the curve of the normal Caribbean, only 21 miles long and 14 miles wide at the very widest point. Great tourist place now, a great tourist location now. When I was growing up, I was right there on the beach, and my birth was coincident with the sound of the sea. So that if I had to have a rhythm, that rhythm should have been sea song. But instead of which, I had the rhythm of John Keats in my head, or the hymns that we had to sing at school. And my first concern, of course, was how to describe my landscape. But instead of describing what I have started by talking about, that arc of islands, those ships passing like ghosts on the horizon, that sense that there were other places nearby, which I got from the coconuts that came up on the waves of the water, I was trying to write what Keats would have written if he lived in Barbados, the pools that were stranded on the beach. So that my early poetry was about, oh lonely pool, oh starving pool, oh bleeding pool, all the variations that one could imagine or unimagine on the notion of pool and of loneliness and of separation. But as I grew older, I was more and more aware of the sound of the sea and the surf and the presence of this archipelago just beyond our horizon. And my concern was, how could I write about this? And I tried to write about it no longer in the tones of Keats, but I tried Wordsworth's approach or John Milton's approach. But I still discovered that the models that they were giving me did not permit me to capture that susu of the sea, that sibilance that the sea suggests, that glitter of the water, right? That syncopation, in fact, of wave, that feel of wind on the skin. And without that sense that I've just described, I could not even appropriate the history of our region, the sense that we had come from this magnificent archipelago, that we had had Atlantis as part of our tradition and things like that. And for a long time, like many of us, I found it difficult to move beyond the simple poem. Until one day, I began to notice that the glints on the water of the waves were very similar to the glints on the steel pans that our people had invented, let's say in the 1940s, developing into the great steel bands of Trinidad and Antigua. And that gave me a hint. I said, now if the steel band is very much like the sun on the water glinting, surely there must be a sound similar to the steel band, which might also symbolize our sense of sea and of sand and of history. So that instead of thinking of patum, 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 which did not really help me to capture the Trinidad, Antigua, that glint of islands, perhaps there was another rhythm that was more native, more ancient, more modern at the same time, which I could use. And one day this came to me. Ta-tum, tum, ta-tum, tum, tum, ta-tum, ta-tum, tum.
Do you have a piece, a line or two?
In fact, I have something which I could do that, right? Because you see, what I'm showing you is that the change from ba-bum, 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 that marching rhythm of Europe, you know, the capture of the Light Brigade, the Battle of Waterloo, all of that is in those songs. What I was beginning to capture now was something entirely different. It was our sense of commune, our sense of being together, our sense of being eccentric to the developing world in one way and still being very central to our own native soul. And the poem that I wrote went like this. And in it you will see how I developed not only a sense of the geography of the Caribbean, simple as it may be, but also a sense of the history at the same time. The poem is called Calypso, quite rightly, and it begins like this. The stone had skidded, arced and bloomed into islands, Cuba, San Domingo, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Guadalupe, Bonaire. Curved stone hissed into reef, wave teeth fanged into clay, white splash flashed into spray, Bathsheba, Montego Bay, bloom of the arcing summers. And that is the trigger which opens my poetry.
And that's a beautiful illustration, since it not only makes the point you've been developing about rhythms, but also it comprehends, it accommodates all the islands. I mean, Cuba, Santo Domingo.
Catches the arc of the island, yes.
You mentioned syncopation, and since we're on to music, I know that jazz has also been important in your work, and this will, of course, give our viewers a kind of point of connection, since we're in the USA now.
Now jazz would follow, you see, because what happens is that in my work, and it is not only in my work, in my poetry you have this very, very strong emphasis, but in the work of our novelists too, departing from the model of Dickens, as you will hear as the programs develop, into the models of our spoken speech. You have to do this in order to capture our own reality. And in moving away from the iambic pentameter and the English models, I not only moved into Calypso, which is ours, but into a rhythm that was available to me from since I was growing up. My first acquisition as a schoolboy was my headmaster's gramophone. I didn't thief it from him. I actually bought it with my first earnings. And I used to wind this thing up and go down to the record shops and buy what in the 50s was the latest thing in jazz, the bebop era, the world of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And I wrote, therefore, as a tribute not only to those early mentors of my poetry, but as a way of going further away from what I call the tyranny of that particular model. Were a few poems which I called jazz poems. Let me give you an example.
Yes, example.
Again, an example, I'll have to use this as my drum. This is to Kenny Clark, you know, the bebop drummer, but it could apply to any jazz drummer, and I try to symbolize in my words the sound of the cymbal and the trap drums and the various patterns that you'll find in jazz. The drummer is thin and has been a failure at every trade but this. But here he is the king of the cats. It is he who kills them. Now that is the kind of thing which makes it possible to bring into one's poetry experiences which are not otherwise possible using the traditional pentameter, the traditional rhythms of English European poetry.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but there's one drum. Drum brings me to one aspect of your own personal history and development, which is important in your work. You did spend some time living and working in Ghana.
Yes.
Might you quickly say something about how that relates?
I went to Ghana by accident, not because I had any missionary zeal, but because I wanted to discover more about where Caribbean came from. And I knew from my mother that Caribbean had one of its ancestors in Africa. And I arrived there at the time of the independence movement of the Ghanaian people in the Gold Coast. But what was most significant for me was that, first of all, I learned that cornflakes was not the most important breakfast food for everybody in the world. That was part of my de-education. And I also learned that the drum was the voice of God. And perhaps we could end by this little tribute I have here to the voice of God called Atumpan. This is when in West Africa the drums speak a certain language of ritual. And it begins, kong, 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 kung, 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 funtumi akore, twenibo akore, twenibo kodia, kodia tweniduru, odamankuma charimase, odamankuma charimase, oko babia, wamani ho meni so, wamani ho meni so. And then I begin to translate it, and it goes like this. Funtumi akore, twenibo akore, Spirit of the cedar tree, Trenibo Okia, or the Makuma Charima says, that he has come from sleep, and is arising.
Thanks. I think you've given us a wonderful introduction, not only to your own work, but to Caribbean writing and to this whole series. Maybe in a sentence or two, that's impossible, but could you just say how you see the future of Caribbean writing, whether you're optimistic about it?
I'm very optimistic. I mean, the fact that we are here doing this program, that we have 20 young, exciting writers with us, that the Caribbean continues to have the kind of experience which is the very stuff of poetry and of literature, and that our people, I think this is most important of all, have unspoiled souls. I think this is what is really the thing. I think in this 20th, 21st century, we are now emerging, and there's so much to be said that it's going to take us another 300 years to say it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Kamau Brathwaite.
Thank you.
You've opened our series excellently well. We've been speaking with Professor Edward Kamau Brathwaite, poet and professor of history, in the series Caribbean Writers and Their Art,